So how many of you all have had the joy and the opportunity to get together with other people here in this congregation for a chalice circle or an adult exploration class or one of our mini discussion groups? Awesome. I love those. That's one of my favorite things that we do. And I have to tell you that in one of the classes that I was leading last spring here at All Peoples, one of our newest members shared with the group a personal observation. This person said that in just a few months of coming here, they had learned more about the history of this congregation and the history of Unitarian Universalism than that they had ever learned about the history of the church that they had attended from the years of childhood to early adulthood. I thought about it and I thought, this person is right. We really like to talk about our history. Perhaps some of us think that we like to talk about our history a little too much. But I think that for Unitarian Universalists, understanding and celebrating where we have been as a religious movement is important. It is important because our history is much more than just dry facts about dates and names and places. Our UU history is an exciting story. It is a story of theological evolution. Unitarian Universalism truly is a religious movement characterized by the firm belief that revelation is continuous, that we are all on a never-ending quest together. And thus, how we understand ourselves and how we see the universe today will not necessarily be how we comprehend things in the future. Our UU history is a compelling saga of twists and turns, with new concepts and new ideas springing up, causing arguments, some being rejected, others embraced. Ultimately, each new idea transforming how we believe and how we do church together. Unitarian Universalism of the past and the present is a grand reflection of our own personal searches for truth and meaning. As we go forward today on this journey of evolutionary faith, there are some among us who want to hang on to the familiar, to stay where we have been in our beliefs, and forget about trying out new approaches to spirituality. Some in our larger UU movement, folks like Michael Werner, who we heard from in our reading this morning, have even suggested that, maybe perhaps we as an institution are headed off in the wrong direction. Werner is by no means the first person in our history to stand up and to say, wait a minute. And he is far from the last to make a compelling case for returning to some point in our shared theological past. Today, I want to talk a little bit about humanism, a vital part of our Unitarian Universalist theological rainbow. Humanism largely shaped much of the history of this congregation and took on a dominant presence in many Unitarian Universalist churches during the 20th century. Now, before we go further, I think it might be helpful for me to define for you what I think humanism is and is not. Now, this is just my opinion, and you are more than free to disagree. In fact, I invite and encourage you to disagree. I mean, if everything you hear from this pulpit only reconfirms what you already think, we are all doing something wrong. To me, humanism is not atheism, although the two terms are often used synonymously. Atheism is a stance against the belief in a supernatural God. It is simply the rejection of the faith espoused by many, but not all, religious traditions. Humanism, on the other hand, is the perspective that as long as the existence of a god or gods remains unprovable and maybe unknowable, then perhaps our time, our attention, and our devotion is best used to honor human life and human potential, and engaging in the work of creating the good in the here and the now. Now, in this congregation, we are far from being monolithic or dogmatic. Here at All Peoples, every member, every friend, every visitor and guest of every age, and every minister too, I might add, has the freedom to embrace or reject any specific spiritual perspective. When I talk about theological trends within Unitarian Universalism, I'm not talking about personal spirituality. Rather, what I'm talking about is what we do and what we say when we worship and learn and play together in a religious community. To explore humanism and the world of Unitarian Universalism as I find it today, I'd like us to go back in time just a little. To go back to what I think is one of the most important and vital, yet rarely talked about chapters in our history. The year was 1949, and the Universalist Church of America was in dire straits. Universalist membership was in deep decline. Many of the small rural churches founded a century before were struggling, many on the verge of closing. Many, if not most, Unitarian churches had moved on from their historically, strictly Christian roots by that time, and had moved on to embracing forms of rationalist and scientific humanism. In an effort to revitalize Universalism, the Massachusetts State Convention decided to bring a brash young Unitarian minister from the Midwest all the way to Boston and give him the pulpit of a church in the heart of the city. That minister was Kenneth Patton. And the style of worship and the theology that he preached at the church that he founded, which was called the Charles Street Meeting House, it deeply influenced our UU identity. Ken Patton was what today we would politely call a non-theist. His personal beliefs were firmly grounded in humanism and religious naturalism. Yet he also had this uncanny ability to make humanism sound incredibly spiritual. Patton's poetry and liturgical readings are lyrical, inspiring, transcendent, and beautiful. In his book, The Wonders of Life, Ken Patton wrote, "The mystical experience is due not to the flooding in upon us of divine power, but the flooding out of us of human power. The goal of living is not a mythical far-off happening, but an everyday quality of being, the total engagement of the self, in which all that is the self confronts and penetrates all that is the world." Patton transformed the sanctuary of his church into what he called a temple for the religion of realities. A giant painting of the great nebula of Andromeda was placed in the front of the room, and symbols of all of the world's great faith traditions adorned the walls, along with a giant bookshelf containing Bibles and Torahs and Buddhist texts, as well as works by great philosophers and scientists and biologists. Patton called on his parishioners to seek, and I quote, "the actual and living oneness which connects all of nature with all of humanity." His writings and his sermons were reproduced on a printing press in the basement of the church, and his works were widely circulated throughout Universalist and Unitarian congregations all across the country. Many of Patton's songs and readings can be found in that gray hymnal that is in the chair right in front of you this morning. A book about the Charles Street Meeting House that was published back in 2002 is titled Ken Patton, A Bold Experiment. It is an apt title because Patton's ministry and his vision was an innovative attempt to combine rational humanism with spiritual mysticism. A vision that I think might not only be a part of our past, but maybe even a path to our future. Over the past 20 years, in most Unitarian Universalist congregations, we have seen a sustained movement to become less exclusively humanist and to begin to be more welcoming and embracing of theism and mysticism, of paganism and religious naturalism, and a whole host of other viewpoints. Now, while this is an ever-evolving trend, and one that makes folks like Michael Lerner and many others in many of our communities a little uneasy, I have to say that I think that making room for people who understand and see God in radically different ways is the best way for us all to live out our core values, those values of respect and acceptance. And it does not mean that we are turning away from reason or science or our focus on human relationships. It just means that we have come to the understanding that one answer or one approach to theology isn't enough and never will be. I believe that many Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist communities wholeheartedly embraced radical humanism 50 years ago as the next step on their journeys, much as folks from our past had embraced new ideas like liberal Christianity and the social gospel and transcendentalism in centuries past. Today, this journey has led us to become more multi-theological and pluralistic because we realize that an exclusivist approach, whether it's based on rationalism or on Christianity, doesn't serve all of our needs. It only limits what we can become as a congregation. You know, it seems unreasonable to me to continue to be a church of only one way of believing when we know that we might learn more and be more if we opened ourselves up to additional ideas and perspectives. Today, as UUs, here at All Peoples, we talk about reason and we talk about God. We talk about mystery and we talk about science. We talk about action and we talk about prayer. And we do so as a way of honoring our intellects and our feelings, our history and our future. We know that we need all of that. Now, I can tell you that there are many Unitarian Universalists who remain critical of this renewed use of traditional religious language in our pulpits. I remember vividly being at my mom and dad's UU fellowship over in West Virginia. It was like 20 years ago, I think, actually. And I was there for an adult forum discussion before the service. And the guest speaker that morning was the former president of our Unitarian Universalist Association, a man named Bill Sinkford, who's from right up the river in Cincinnati. And Bill Sinkford came to that discussion group, and he was bombarded by parishioners who were very upset with him because he was the president of our UU association running around using terms like God and prayer and salvation. One man at that forum said, you know, you cannot use those words because the definition is not clear. I think most of us have been told at some point in our lives that the word God has a prescribed meaning. We certainly are aware that when people at other houses of worship around us here use that word God, that they mean a being that is separate from us, whose power creates and sustains and maybe even judges the world. Half a century ago, theologian Paul Tillich sought to redefine that word, to redefine what God might mean. Tillich suggested that God could simply be that which is of ultimate concern. Now, some humanists and others, including Michael Werner, scoff at this, saying that, well, that means that God could be anything, or God could be everything. God could be football, if that's what you're really into. Or God could be money, if that's how you make your important life decisions and they revolve around material comforts. And of course, they're right. But, isn't that the whole idea of religious community? At least our type of religious community. To be a place that pushes us to name and to claim what it is that we actually find most important, and to try to live more for what we really believe is of supreme worth. For me, calling that God isn't being fuzzy with definitions. It's just taking a word that has so much power and trying to apply it honestly to the realities that are around me now. And we shouldn't forget that for people in many parts of the world, God is in fact everything. For Hindus and Sikhs, and to an extent even Buddhists, they all say that things are all metaphysically connected. And therefore what is sacred is present in every moment, in every experience, in every person and thing. God is in all. That's not some radical thing. That's ancient Eastern philosophy. Now, Ken Patton didn't use the word God very often, but he also did not consider himself to be an atheist. Patton once wrote, "In practice, the term atheist does not mean that a person does not believe in God. It just means that he does not believe in my God." Because ideas of God are really just our sincere attempts to conceive the underlying and decisive forces of the universe that have evolved and sustain us and orient us. The only real atheism, says Ken Patton, is a lack of faith in those forces. To disbelieve that humanity, through growth and industry and intelligence and moral stamina, can bring about a higher and more abundant life, that's atheism. That's what Ken Patton said. Now, I think that Patton is saying to us today that perhaps we need to think a lot more about what we do believe rather than what we don't. And that we can and that we should have a religion which is not about drawing the lines pertaining to words like God or atheism. Not saying that they have to mean anything to anyone, but rather being about building a community of exploring openly and honorably what those kinds of words and ideas might mean, guided by our reason and also by our humility and our hearts. I think that that is the religion that generations of Universalists and Unitarians spent their lives striving to create, and that we are called to continue to create. Ken Patton's exploration of defining a deeply spiritual humanism was called a bold experiment. I think in many ways that is what Unitarian Universalism is, a bold experiment. A bold experiment into becoming a broad, alive, and ever-changing religious movement where many truths are honored and reason and experience inform our search. And the awesome part of all this is that you and I are here together to share in that bold experiment. Who knows exactly where the next chapter of our theological journey might lead or how it might unfold. But it will be a little different for each of us. And those differences are what make it all worth it. They are what will keep this congregation and our larger Unitarian Universalist tradition relevant and growing and inviting. And that is because those differences are what will keep us learning and keep us exploring and keep us never convinced that we know it all. As we freely search onward, may we honor the perspectives of our past, the liberal Christians, the libertarians, the humanists, and all the other sources and inspirations that we call on. And may we keep boldly imagining new ways, new ideas, new beliefs, new ways of being. So may it be.